Adam Penenberg gehört zu den renommiertesten Journalisten in den Vereinigten Staaten. 1998 enttarnte er die Fälschungen des aufstrebenden New York Times-Reporters Stephan Glass. Heute ist Penenberg Professor an der New York University und sucht mit seinen Studenten neue Wege für den Journalismus der Zukunft. Dabei bezieht er auch kommerziell erfolgreiche Unternehmen wie Apple, eBay oder Skype mit ein.
You know, I've changed my thinking on the topic over the years, and although in the past I've called myself an investigative journalist just because I used to dig deep into documents and things like that, and to really dig deep, but I kind of think that all good in journalism is investigative journalism. So I'm kind of jettisoning the concept of investigative journalism and just thinking of good journalism and bad journalism. And good journalism is the kind where you actually look for information and you dig and you create a system in which you can envelop a ton of information and then package it in a way that can be understandable to people, whether it's through a narrative or through a hard news piece or what have you. I think that in the past, investigative journalism has conjured up images of digging around and wearing undercover, clothing and undercover microphones, undercover cameras. But I think that's kind of changed, and I think that the way that good journalism would be to kind of take those characteristics. I'm not sure there's an investigative ideal. What's fascinating is my colleague here at New York University wrote the definitive biography of Nellie Bly. So all I know about Nellie Bly is what I read in her book, which is excellent, Brooke Roger. Nellie Bly, what she did was she went undercover. She went into an insane asylum and checked herself in and pretended to be something she wasn't in order to get the story. That's wonderful. I don't mean to discredit that. Nowadays, if you did that, though, you'd run into all sorts of liability and legal issues. You just can't do that kind of thing anymore. I think that the fear of lawsuits has been a chill for a long time, and it's only been until recently that the economic pressures have really come to bear. In the past, investigative journalism was subsidized by other parts of the paper. Sure, classified ads, for example, which now, of course, are declining and have declined over the last 8-10 years. Craigslist has, really cornered the market on that. In general, what has occurred is that newspapers in general subsidize the sections that didn't really pay that well, but were really a public service. And so now there's a move afoot to make investigative journalism a nonprofit structure, which, I think the jury's still out on that one. I don't know whether that's going to work or not. I mean, it would really depend on whether people get tired of funding it. You're beholden to the people who are funding you, and that, of course, seems to be returning to like the days of Medici in Renaissance Italy, where you need benefactors. Does investigative journalism need benefactors? I'm not sure that's the right way to go. I hate to sound like I'm a cynic when it comes to human nature, but I think that if there's an opportunity for someone to take advantage of a situation, someone will take advantage of it. The question is, do we recognize it? Does the reading public recognize it? And I'm not sure that the reading public does. I'm not sure it's possible to even understand. I mean, who has time when you're reading, dozens and dozens of news stories every week to delve down into figuring out how, credible is the source? I don't mean the source in the story. I mean the source who's published the story. It's almost impossible in this day of blogs and online zines and magazines and newspapers and wire services, and now we're awash in information. And so, what I think the next step in all of this is some way to organize all that information, and hopefully someone will come up with a way of doing that. I think it's possible, although I think the journalists at ProPublica are excellent. And I'm not sure I buy the bias argument. I almost think that's kind of a complaint that comes from the conservative base in this country. But I do think it's more of an economic argument. I mean, is that a sustainable model to be relying on outside funding for investigative journalism? If you're funding something, don't you have a stake in its outcome? What stops a company from funding investigative journalism? A pharmaceutical company from funding investigative journalism, and through all sorts of shady kinds of front companies or front organizations. I mean, my worry is that this kind of funding structure, which cannot be regulated, could lead to all sorts of investigative pieces that aren't truly investigative. What they are really just ways to prop up someone's ideology. What was really interesting about the Stephan Glass story is it happened 11 years ago now, more than 11 years ago. And when we broke that story at Forbes.com, people were truly shocked that somebody not only could have fabricated the one story that we nailed him on, but to have fabricated 24 stories for not just the New Republic, but for Harper's Magazine, George Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine, magazines that had fact checkers for the most part. It was truly shocking. 5 years later, almost to the day, the Jason Blair scandal emerged, and the New York Times published that 14,000 word or 11,000 word mea culpa. What was truly amazing is I read it in a taxi cab of all places, just riveted by it. And one of the interesting things in there was that the reporters talked about what they did to fact check Jason Blair when it became apparent that he had fabricated. And they contacted a source in one of his stories, and they said, "Why didn't you complain when he had made up a scene at your house and had described the mountains in the background incorrectly and had attributed quotes to you and had never talked to you? Why didn't you say anything?" And the person said, "Well, that's just what we thought reporters do." And I think in that 5-year period, what had occurred was that these scandals that came to light were just the most obvious ones, but I think that there was a real tipping point in the way that people perceived media, and it continues to this day. And a really telling Gallup poll, what they do is every year they will do a Gallup poll, and they will poll 1,000 Americans or something along those lines and ask them to rate certain occupations based on how much you trust them. And routinely, journalists are near the bottom of the list, right between politicians and used car salesmen. I think that's all you really need to know about how the public feels about journalism. It's very interesting. Maybe in the past, people felt this way. Maybe journalists have never had credibility. I mean, I think what's so funny is people always seem to look back and think, oh, the halcyon days of the past, it was so much better. Really? Let's go back to the turn of the 20th century, and you had those, the term yellow journalism came into vogue, and you had Randolph Hearst who ginned up an entire war because he could. I mean, you've had bad newspapers forever. You've had, for 100 years, you've had kind of, reporting that passed as fact, and although it was fiction. So how do we know that today it's any worse? Maybe today they're just as bad as they've always been, and that people are more aware of it. And maybe the answer is just more sunlight. Maybe the concept that we have more opportunity for people to express themselves online and to blog and to criticize, maybe that's a good thing. A new technology that comes down the pike often reflects the technology from which it spawned. For example, they called it horseless carriages for a reason, the first cars. They looked like carriages that ran behind horses that had a motor on them. But of course, today's Porsches, or BMWs don't look anything like a horseless carriage. The same goes for the first tanks. In World War I, the first tanks looked like tractors that just happened to have really big guns attached. Well, tanks today don't look anything like that. And I would argue that today's media online will not look anything like its print brethren. But first they have to get rid of the idea that they have to reflect that. And when they do, they'll come up with an ad unit. What media needs today is a new search unit. And they have to kill off the banner ad. And when they do that, I think they'll be in much better shape. And maybe this crowdsourcing model is the way to gain trust. Maybe the best antidote for the lack of trust is to simply do better work, and when people dissect it, they'll find that there's no problem with it. Maybe that's the cure. Why do people need journalism? I'll tell you something. I make another argument, you know, and it may be a little far-fetched, but I'm going to throw it out to you anyway. If you look at the most successful businesses and concepts in the last, I don't know, 50 years, many of them have been what I call organizational technologies. Take the iPod and the iTunes on Apple. Look, Apple doesn't create the music, all right? What they did is they found a way to organize it so that you could put it on your iPod. That's an organizational technology. Google is an organizational technology. What is a search engine? They don't create the content. They don't create what's posted on the internet. What they do is they organize it, and then they help you find things. There is amazing amounts of money and success in a business or concept that's able to organize something. And what is the ultimate organizational technology? A journalist. Why? Because a good journalist goes out there and takes disparate pieces of information and puts them together in a package and then unveils them in a way that a regular person can read it and then understand what's going on, and hopefully in an engaging way. I would argue that journalism is the ultimate organizational technology, and there's a great need for that because we are awash in information. Search for any term on the internet and you pull up 1 billion results sometimes, or hundreds of millions of results, or tens of thousands, way more than you could ever go through. You need something or somebody to go through and organize it. You know, there's value in this expertise. And I would argue that journalists bring great expertise to information and creating it or packaging it in a way that people can understand. And that is worth a lot. Now, the economic model still needs to be, you know, worked out, but I bet you in 5 years we won't be having this conversation. Like with a record, remember you look at it, you see the grooves. You could actually, there's like a connection you have with the art. And then with the CD, you didn't have that anymore.
That's right, yeah.
And then with an MP3 player, there is no art.
Yeah. No,
and you only listen to one piece, one song here, one song there. It changes the way that you consume music.
Yeah.
And I think this changes the way that you consume media as
Mr.
well.
Kennedy also said he had always accepted the finding of a presidential commission that a sole gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was responsible for President John F. Kennedy's assassination.
Okay. Thanks for